So a lot of the work in non-equilibrium stat mech um, looks at the trajectories and the process of like locally reversing entropy, sorting air particles and putting fast-moving air particles on the right and slow-moving air particles on the left. That was maybe useful for thinking that you could pump entropy out of the system.
Hi, I'm Slater with Bain Capital Ventures, and today we're talking with Jascha Sohl-Dickstein. Jascha is best known for inventing diffusion models, and that's the technology behind many of today's creative AI applications. So if you've used a text-to-image gen model, for example, something like MidJourney, Ideogram, DALL, Stable Diffusion, Black Forest Labs, ImageGen from Google, all of those products are based on diffusion models. In today's interview, we will talk about the original diffusion paper from 2015. We'll talk about Jascha's interpretation of all of the diffusion research that came after that. And we'll also get into the theoretical physics that inspired diffusion in the first place and led to many of the key insights in that original paper. Enjoy.
In 2015, you wrote this paper. I think it was deep unsupervised learning using non-equilibrium thermodynamics. Maybe to start, could you talk a little bit about what the research world in deep learning looked like at that phase? This was pretty early. I think that this was a couple of years after AlexNet. We'd just gotten to the point of being at, sort of human level performance for image classification, like let alone, anything generative. So this is really early to work on generative problems in a way. And what made you interested in this problem then? Sort of what was the prehistory of this paper?
Yeah, this was... So maybe the prehistory of this paper is that I had done a PhD in computational neuroscience, and a question that we thought a lot about was how the brain learned the representations that it learned. And there's one class of hypotheses in neuroscience for how that learning happens, which is that maybe the brain is building a probabilistic model of its input. And what that means is maybe the brain is solving a task where it sees an image and it tries as hard as it can to accurately assign how probable would this image be to occur in the world. And if the brain does a really, really, really good job of this, then in some sense, it understands everything that's possible to know about the world. You can describe the full distribution over things that you see in the world, then you must somehow have learned everything about what makes something likely in the world or unlikely in the world.
Yeah. Sorry,
I'll go for the piece.
I was going to say that in a way is a very, I don't know, abstract or sort of a high-minded aspiration. And so you sort of had almost this world model idea from the
Yeah, I've wanted to learn world models. Yeah. And I spent a lot of my PhD trying to learn world models and then looking to see if the same representations that were learned inside the world models were also found in recordings from the brain.
Yeah.
The answer to that is, well, it was often hard to know, but often you could find a place where the answer was yes.
Yeah.
Maybe in parallel to that, I had this. I had been a physics undergrad and I was doing biophysics PhD, and we had this group of people at Berkeley where I did my PhD who were really interested in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics.
Yeah.
And non-equilibrium. So, equilibrium statistical mechanics is you have a system and the system has no inputs and no outputs, and you let it sit there for a really, really, really long time, and it settles to whatever kind of ground state it's going to be in. Yeah. So maybe you put a whole bunch of particles in a box and you look at the distribution of where the particles are going to be in that box, and maybe all the particles start off on one side of the box, but you let the system settle, the particles flow back and forth, the gas fills the box, and you get some equilibrium distribution. Non-equilibrium statistical mechanics is when you model systems that haven't settled yet.
Yeah.
And maybe they haven't settled yet because they're constantly getting new inputs and outputs, or maybe they haven't settled yet because you're like seeing them early in time instead of really, really late in time.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like there's these known correspondences between equilibrium statistical mechanics and a lot of concepts in machine learning. There's like a class of like models in machine learning called energy-based models, and these in fact map directly onto like energy-based probabilistic models in StatMech. And even more than that, like you can map any kind of probabilistic model into an energy-based model.
Yeah.
So we know kind of how to build a connection between equilibrium statistical mechanics and machine learning. We did not historically know how to build a connection between like non-equilibrium statistical mechanics and machine learning. And so I think kind of the motivating question was, I kind of had these like thoughts in my head of like, oh, this non-equilibrium stuff is really cool, and it seems like there's these missing connections to machine learning, and I'm really interested in representation learning, and kind of combined them, and somehow ended up like writing the first diffusion models paper.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to ask about specifically is, so in that paper, you mentioned two other papers as inspiration. So one of them is this paper by Jarzynski, and I think there's other paper by Radford Neal.
Yeah.
So Jarzynski is a physicist, Neal is a statistician. And both of these papers don't seem like they're about something in image generation. They're about sort of transforming one distribution into another. Yeah. Especially when one of those distributions is kind of, intractable or sort of difficult to compute. So how did you look at that and say, like, this is probably going to be pretty good for image generation? Yeah. Like, where did that idea come from?
So maybe let me just talk about those papers for a moment first, because those papers are awesome. And maybe there's two ways in which those papers like were really kind of exciting. Maybe one of them is there are like these like laws of thermodynamics, and there's this like second law of thermodynamics. And the second law of thermodynamics is an inequality. It says that that free energy is always going to decrease, or that entropy is always going to increase. Whereas there's this like paper by Jarzynski was in, I want to say like 94. It was like, maybe 97. It's quite old, but it was like, it's interesting because that paper shows that you can rewrite the second law of thermodynamics as an equality rather than an inequality.
Yeah.
You can rewrite it as so second law of thermodynamics says that the change in free energy is always less than the work you put in. This paper shows that you can write this as e to the change in the free energy is equal to the expectation of e to the work you put in. So it's amazing because this like foundational relationship in physics was like written with an inequality when it could have been written with an equality for like many, many, many decades. And the math that is used is actually quite simple, like high school or early college level math. So this is like was super low hanging fruit that just no one noticed, and that's always kind of exciting because like maybe there's more of this. The Radford Neal paper is kind of interesting because it discovered the same relationship but framed in a totally different way. Like Jarzynski had like written down this relationship in terms of like work and energy and like physical quantities. And they even used some like in the original paper, some like super physicsy like Louisville theorem style like math and like constraints and whatnot. Whereas like Radford Neal was like proving something about machine learning. He was like showing that here is a way that you can estimate normalizing constants by sampling trajectories between two different distributions.
Yeah.
And it turned out that like his work mapped exactly onto the physics work. It also, his paper came out just a few years later. It would have been like utterly, in some ways, satisfying if we lived in the alternative universe where the machine learning result was first and like proved something basic about physics. You could actually kind of almost read the point in Radford Neal's paper where he realizes that it was already noticed in physics. But so those are both very cool papers, and they're also very exciting because they're like discovering fundamental new relationships, like really quite late, that should be unfound a long time before. In terms of why I thought that this would work for images, I mean, I had some like intuitions, but I think I also have to admit that it worked far better than I probably guessed it would when I started playing with it. I think kind of the intuition is the way in which diffusion models work is you start with your data distribution. You start with like clean images and you slowly corrupt that image with noise. You slowly allow that image to undergo a diffusion process and look more and more like either a draw from a Gaussian or a draw from a quadratic well. And then rather than trying to map from noise back to an image in one go, you instead get to break it apart into lots of very, very small pieces. So like your generative process is like, let's start with the noisiest case and very, very, very slowly predict the image that had a little bit less noise and a little bit less noise and a little bit less noise. And I think it's this like ability to take many, many, many steps that makes the problem a lot easier.
Yeah. I mean, so from the outside, the thing that seems sort of surprising to me is like, so like on a very small time scale, I sort of believe that you could sort of reverse the diffusion problem. Like it sort of looks roughly the same forwards as it does backwards on like really small time scale. But like, you know, the thing that's surprising is that you can go all the way back in these like small iterative steps. Like, you know, the glass breaks and you can sort of run time backwards. So like put the glass together and like, that's the thing that seems super surprising to me.
Yes,
So,
answer.
yeah. Did you look at these papers and say like, well, this is the thing that we could use to like recover the true data distribution? Like this is sort of like the right tool to use for that problem, or is it kind of surprising?
I think I thought it should work from the start, but I'm always unreasonably optimistic about my own ideas and my own projects.
Yeah.
And 90% of them don't work at all. So you should like calibrate that however you like.
Yeah.
I definitely had a lot of conversations, especially early on in the project, where people were like slightly aghast that had like in the same way you can't unmix pudding.
Yeah, it does seem quite surprising, but it sounds like it wasn't surprising.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's maybe the key is that you're training a model to do this, right? You're not just like running the sequence and hoping it happens to like go back to where it started. You're like training a model to like decrease the entropy and like push it towards a known distribution.
Yeah. I feel like there were these like early, there were some like niceties about getting diffusion models to work that are sort of a little surprising. So like, you know, you remove a lot of data. You know, by default, if you sort of like try to predict an image that sort of would have generated that data, you necessarily have like a more diffuse distribution than like the single point that you started with.
Yeah.
So that's why you get these sort of like fuzzy images when you try to go backwards. And I kind of imagine those problems as seeming like intractable things, but it seems like it worked quite well, you know, even in this initial paper.
Yeah, it worked. It worked certainly for the year in which was published. It worked quite well.
Yeah. Were you surprised when you saw those initial like CFAR images that you generated? You know, when you read those statistical mechanics papers and you sort of saw this general machinery, I still think it's like quite a leap to go from like, okay, we're going to go from that to like image generation. Because I sort of have in my head like, yeah, we have these sort of particle models, and it sort of makes sense that maybe we should be able to sort of transform between these two distributions. But yeah, many people wouldn't have made the leap to saying like, this is going to be really good for generating like samples from the data distribution.
Yeah.
So like intuition for why that happened or why that was true are really interesting.
Maybe, so a lot of the work in non-equilibrium stat mech looks at the trajectories and the process of like locally reversing entropy.
Yeah.
So maybe from some point of view, it wasn't like they weren't thinking about images.
Yeah.
But they were thinking about like Maxwell's demons, like sorting air particles and putting the fast moving air particles on the right and slow moving air particles on the left. So you have a hot side and a cold side. Or they were thinking about kind of these processes that could exchange information for entropy. So Maxwell's demon being an example of this, right? Where the sorting process itself requires like information processing and storage, and like that has a cost that compensates for the benefit that you get of like sorting the particles. But there was a lot of this kind of like idea of there being like crossover between like ideas and information and ideas in thermodynamics, and so maybe that was maybe useful for thinking that you could pump entropy out of the system.
Yeah, you could recover this like very complicated distribution.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I want to ask about is, so like around this time, and this is as a sort of outside perspective, the way that it seems is that I think GANs came out sort of right before this first diffusion paper.
Yeah.
And then, but they were also it was still very early. They didn't work that well. And then I think Alec Rafford had the DC GAN paper that came out a little bit after.
Yeah, it was a bit later.
Yeah. And then there was this era where, it seems from the outside that like for the next 5 years, most of the emphasis in image generation was in GANs. Yeah. And we kind of went through this mini ice age for diffusion models. Yeah. Is that true? Was there interesting research that was happening in diffusion that was sort of less well appreciated or just less
it was mostly forgotten.
Yeah.
There's probably there are probably like GANs, which were the one that everyone was most excited about, or at least enjoyed working on the most.
Yeah.
There were variational nuclears.
Yeah.
And there were also like flow-based models, and those all came out. And then there were diffusion models, and those all came out in a very, very short time relative to each other. I think I suspect that, I know this is true for like the diffusion models and like GANs and VAEs, but I suspect for the others also that probably everyone was like developing the ideas in parallel, and publication times just didn't quite line up. The diffusion models had a small number of follow-up papers, and then ended up like kind of, I think, mostly being forgotten. I moved on to work on other things that I also thought were exciting, and probably in a different world, I like pushed on that for another few papers and maybe.
Yeah.
But I think they also weren't. Diffusion models have some advantages over other techniques. They might have an advantage to image quality, although that's debatable, but they have an advantage in that they're very, very guidable.
Yes.
So you control very, very well what they generate. And they also are like very nicely, like, and it's kind of the same thing, but they're like composable. Like if you want to do in painting, or you want to combine them with a classifier, or you want to control them in some other ways, they work very well for that. They are more expensive. So I think at the time, like we were like pushing the compute limits we had to like generate ugly CFAR images.
Yeah.
And like, I think saying that people should spend 1,000x to compute to like generate CFAR images was it wasn't like a winning.
Yeah. And that was because of the number of reverse steps.
As you see, because you have to like run many reverse steps in order to do it.
Did you, during this era where you sort of view as like the GAN VAE era, did you have the intuition at the time that like, okay, in the long run, it's going to be diffusion models? Because like, I think that's sort of where it's come around to today. Sort of most of the best, sort of commercial, image generators out there. At least it seems to me that like from maybe 2021 until now, everything has been diffusion.
Yes.
So during that like 6-year period, did you have the intuition of like, well, obviously diffusion models are right and all this like GAN and
Yeah, you still, no, I still don't have that intuition actually. Yeah. There are many different things which determine model quality. There's like quality of the training data, there's quantity of the training data, there's like the architecture that you're using to build the model. So like what machine, how you're wiring the neurons together essentially. And then there's a framework like objective function and like training process like GAN or diffusion or whatever. And then there's like things like the optimizer. And I think that there are many tasks. Currently, I think most image, video, audio tasks where diffusion models seem to be the best choice right now.
Yeah.
But the gap is not that huge.
Yeah.
Like you could train an autoregressive model to do any of those tasks, and you could train it as well. And it would probably cost you more compute, and it would be like you'd have to do more awkward things in order to guide the generation. But all of these model classes are capable of doing the same task. It's just like kind of trade-offs at the margin, maybe.
Yeah, makes sense. Maybe one other paper I want to ask you about is the DDPM paper.
Yeah. So yeah.
What was your reaction when that came out? Like, what did you think when you?
I thought it was super cool sign. Like Jonathan Ho shared a draft of it with me, and I was excited. I was like, "Oh, you found that paper? That's great!" And I built on it. I'm super happy he wrote that paper. And it was very gracious of him to like give credit back to the original diffusion work too. I think when I read the paper, I still did not realize how transformative it would be. I think I kind of had this picture in my head that like there are lots of generative modeling approaches, and if you push on any of them, you can get them into roughly the same ballpark of quality.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, diffusion models are in the same class as everything else.
Yeah.
I didn't expect them to take off to the way they have. I think mostly for their like non purely loss based advantages.
Yeah.
I should also say, in parallel, Yang Song at Stanford was at the same time as Jonathan Ho was writing this paper. He was pursuing like
Score-based.
Yeah, these like score-based approaches where he was like doing Langevin sampling while annealing the temperature, which looks a lot. I think it was like experiencing convergent evolution towards like the diffusion-based generative models, and I don't think he wasn't initially aware of the diffusion stuff. So I think probably like Jonathan Ho published this paper. I think the Yang Song would have gotten very similar results in like a year or two. Probably means there were like 3 other labs that were also like working on it. But yeah.
Yeah, that's maybe the last thing I'd love to get your thoughts on is like, so, Sander has this blog post that's like, here's 20 different interpretations of what's going on in diffusion models. And, you can sort of pick each of those papers out of it. Like, sort of here's the DDPM interpretation of it. And sort of here's some ways of looking at sort of the original score-based sort of laying out dynamics thing. Here's kind of like the flow-based matching. Do you view this as all like, these are riffs on the same idea and it's sort of a convergent evolution story? Do you think that some of these ideas are sort of, meaningfully different and was sort of, if we pushed further in that tech tree direction, we'd get to a different place?
Maybe both.
Yeah.
I think it's like the fact that we can tell the story of this model class from so many starting points, I think is very suggestive that there's like it's like somehow like a convergent evolution, like that we were going to get to. I do think different perspectives are likely to provide different capabilities and trade-offs. If you use the like kind of probabilistic graphical model perspective on it, then that like suggests some accelerated sampling techniques, which you probably wouldn't get to otherwise, which are really, really nice.
Similar latency models.
Yeah, and the consistency models are again, Yang Song being amazing, but are another like kind of thinking about it from the flow-based perspective.
Yeah.
Like you wouldn't get to those if you weren't thinking about kind of the flow-based version of it. Yeah, I think it's always useful to think about a problem from multiple perspectives.
Yes. I guess like another thing I'd be curious about is like, this probably seemed like a unusual, maybe somewhat weird research area in circa 2015. There's probably things like that now. I sort of found that, if you had infinite time to sort of like pull ideas like this from physics, specifically for maybe image or video generation, sort of in the neighborhood of diffusion models, are there things that you think are, equally weird and maybe underdeveloped? Like I sort of feel because you wrote this landmark paper, the tech tree, there's like a big trunk, that goes like in the direction of that paper. Yeah. But maybe you would have written, 3 different papers if you had sort of got pulled in different directions. It would have led us onto different development paths.
Yeah, I think diffusion models have like grown to a thicket. Like I can't even read every paper. Like it, I think people are exploring a neighboring space quite densely. I do though think that like, if I was going to work on something that I hope would be impactful today, and I was going to make it weird, I wouldn't be in the space of modeling images. But there are, I can riff on this tiny bit. But the ideas I have are like someone who's like a grad student now is going to have like much fresher, better ideas. Yeah. But like, okay, so a few examples. Maybe one of them is, we built this like deep tech tree on top of like Turing machines. Yeah. But we're using most of that compute for is like non-Turing computation. Like we need systems that take inputs and then produce outputs in a nonlinear fashion from those inputs, and with some kind of like statistical properties of the input-output mapping. You should probably like look at some of the like infinite width literature if you want to like characterize what maybe those statistical properties should be. But there's like some like statistical properties we believe are important for the input-output mapping, and it needs to be nonlinear, and it needs to have a lot of knobs you can turn to change the mapping. Yeah. It doesn't need to like run if-else statements or for loops or anything. It just needs to be a complicated, nonlinear, adjustable system. And I think that we're implementing these systems using like logic gates because we have this deep tech tree, but you could imagine like taking a very non-Turing kind of approach. And that could be super fun and super cool. Was that like a sort of analog computing idea, or what do you mean by sort of non-Turing? Yeah. I mean, there's a few ways you could do it, right? So analog computing would be one. Yeah. One version of this is you find like a physical substrate. Yeah. That you can just directly use. Another way to do it would be to a lot of the complexity around our current training has to do with implementing backprop. Yeah. If you could find a way to train your model based only on forward props, then that might like allow you to throw away just a lot of the supporting complexity and hardware and like time and there's like maybe another one is so machine learning has this like character that it's an idea that people had tried in the like 60s and the 80s, and maybe especially in the 80s they tried architectures very similar to what we're doing today, and it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is because it was a good idea, but we didn't have enough compute and we didn't have enough data. Yeah. You can maybe think about what other ideas have that same character. And one example, I think actually Andre Karpathy suggested this, but I think one example is like evolutionary computing.
Yeah.
So in evolutionary computing, we know it works. We know evolution works, at least. But when people have tried to do evolutionary computing, it's mostly failed historically. And a very likely reason that it's mostly failed is that it just hasn't had the scale of like compute or training data necessary to make it work.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's sort of like all this work that was done on it like 30 years ago or something like that. You know, the fact that it looks like a dead tree is mostly because like it was so starved for compute.
Yeah.
And you know, in fact, maybe we should be trying again now.
Yeah, maybe go back to that and make it work. Meta learning has that same character, maybe, where we know that given enough compute and enough data, learned functions always outperform hand design functions, but we still hand design our optimizers and hand design our loss functions and hand design our architectures. And there's like some work in meta learning, but I think it hasn't nearly lived up to the like, I think there's a lot of room for landmark papers out there.
Super interesting. Well, maybe just one closing question I want to ask you is, so you write this, very famous paper in 2015, and it sort of creates like the modern diffusion paradigm. I think maybe some of the things that happened subsequent to that were not surprising to you. I would sort of regard them as things that, there's not a big belief update for them.
Yeah.
But probably some things were quite surprising over the next, 10 years. I'm curious, as you look back, what was most surprising to you? Where you think of like, I would not have predicted this when I wrote this paper in 2015.
Oh man, yeah. In 2015, we were modeling 32 by 32 image patches poorly.
Yeah.
I would not have predicted then that in less than 10 years, we would be generating like video and audio that was nearly indistinguishable from reality.
Yeah.
I think just the raw capabilities of these models has been utterly surprising to me.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for doing this. Really enjoyed our conversation.
That was a pleasure.
Thanks, Jascha.
Maybe.